Hello everyone, and good evening. This is the first installment of Rebel Power Hour. These probably actually won't last an hour at the beginning, because I'm just kind of setting out on YouTube to find some followers. And maybe in the future I'll set up an actual podcast. But right now I'm just going to confine myself to YouTube. I wanted to deal today with a misconception that exists in most people's minds. I found that this misconception exists amongst members of the Glenn Beck wing of the Tea Party, amongst people who consider themselves liberals, and even amongst people who consider themselves to be socialists. Or at least some people that consider themselves to be socialists. And this misconception is that Karl Marx was just anti-capitalist across the board. That he just didn't like capitalism because he thought it was mean or hateful. And nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is, for a lot of Karl Marx's life, he was a supporter of capitalism. You could even call him a radical for capitalism. But not in the same sense that Ayn Rand is a radical for capitalism. At the same time that he was supporting the rise of capitalism, he was also a communist. And this might sound like a contradiction to most people, but it's actually not. Let me start at the beginning. Karl Marx was born in 1818. At this point in time, a process which had started in the late 1600s was reaching fever pitch. This was the process by which capitalism was revolutionizing Europe. Marx believed that human society had risen through stages of development. Tribal systems of primitive accumulation had given way to the slave societies that eventually developed in nations like Carthage and Rome and Greece, or at least the Greek city-states. In these systems, slave ownership was the basis of wealth and power in society. Only slave owners could vote in Greece or be members of the Roman Senate in the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. Slave ownership and pillaging were the basis of wealth creation. You went out, you captured slaves, or new slaves were born, you bought and sold slaves, and then they created the goods for society, and they created the things that society needed. The other way was you went out and you attacked somebody else's, either their city-state or their kingdom or whatever, and you pillaged it and brought the wealth back to either Rome or Athens or wherever it was you were based out of. Under this system, if you were part of the lower classes, which were the slaves, which made up the majority of Roman society, life was not terribly good for you. You were owned by a particular master. He could do as he pleased with you. He could have you killed. He could have you beaten. He could molest you sexually. You were a piece of property to be bought and sold. Eventually, however, this system gave way to feudalism. Under feudalism, the basis of wealth was land ownership. The ruling elite were the ones that owned the land. Now, of course, they made up some dogma about how they were actually just stewards of the land for God. But the truth was, they were the ones that owned and ran everything. Under this system, you were no longer a slave if you were part of the lowest class. You were a peasant or a serf, which means you couldn't be bought and sold independently. You weren't a piece of property yourself anymore, but you were tied to property. You were tied to the land. Whoever owned the land was your master. You could only leave the land with your master's permission. You had to give over part of what you produced, or probably most of what you produced, to him, and then kept part of it for your own consumption. And that was the basic way feudalism worked. But like I said, in the 1600s, the late 1600s, a new system began to rise in Europe. Capitalism. Unlike feudalism, capitalism was based not on land ownership, but wealth ownership or capital ownership, and the ability of someone to produce commodities for the market and sell them on the marketplace. That was the basis of ownership and wealth. The land might be part of that, but only so much as you were producing something on the land and then selling it on the market, or you were hiring other people to do it. Marx supported capitalism. He had supported the way that the rise of capitalism had eroded the power base of the feudal ruling elites in England, and the way eventually it had just overthrown them outright in America and in France. He was also very supportive of capitalism's need to innovate and its need to rely on technology in order to increase production, and its basis in science. He thought that science could liberate humanity. And the way that, science and the way it was against the dogmatism of the church. He supported capitalism in that arena. He also supported the liberal democratic ideas that came in with capitalism, especially the ideas that were personified in the Bill of Rights and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. He supported all these ideas. And this is the reason he supported Italian and German unification, because a unified German state gave much more strength to the native German capitalists against the feudal principalities. The capitalists were becoming stronger than the feudal ruling families in Germany, and that's the reason he supported unification. He also supported the Union in the American Civil War, because he thought the Union represented modern industrial capitalism. He thought that America was the most progressive nation on earth at the time period, and that the Union was fighting a war against what he saw as a semi-feudal chattel slavery system in the U.S. South, and that a Union victory would destroy that system in the South and bring forth capitalism in that area. Though Marx supported capitalism, he also noticed its contradictions and problems. Though the peasants were freed from the land, they were now forced into a new form of bondage called wage labor, in which the lower classes were given the choice of working under conditions they had no control over. They had been freed from the land, but now they had a new problem. They could either work someplace, they didn't control production, they didn't control their working conditions, or they could not do that and they could starve. Also, even though capitalism was socializing labor more and more everywhere it spread, wealth ownership and the control of production was being more and more centralized into fewer and fewer hands. You can see that in America today, how the top 1% of the population controls 40% of the wealth in the country. Marx believed that ultimately, just how feudalism had run its course, so would capitalism. He eventually concluded that with the advent of modern colonialism and the end of radical Reconstruction in the United States, the period in which European and American capitalism were capable of creating social progress was over. From now on, if social progress was to occur, it was because the working classes, and sometimes the working classes in alliance with the middle class, had forced it upon the capitalists. And that was Marx's actual view towards capitalism. There may still be technological progress under capitalism, but it was not done for the benefit of humanity, but only the benefit of a few, ultimately, and only a few were engulfed by it. And that was Marx's view towards capitalism. He didn't just think it was mean or hateful. He believed that it was a good system to a certain point, but then he thought that there was a better way forward after that. Just as the way feudalism was better than the slave system, and capitalism was much better than feudalism, he thought that socialism could be even better. It could still support technology and innovation to an even greater extent than capitalism had. And it could be an even freer system. So it wasn't that he was just anti-capitalist. He thought that capitalism was a stepping stone in the development of humanity. And those were his real beliefs.